All right. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the internet, and welcome to our weekly interview and concert series. We're here today at the Museum of Glass in Tacoma, Washington. We've been gone for a couple weeks on tour, but we're back now getting things rolling, and we're very happy to have with us today the great drummer and educator and composer, Greg Williamson. Greg, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we've talked about doing this before, but the schedules kind of didn't work out, but we're making it work today. I always forget to mention this, so hopefully, well, I'll start by now by saying, if you have any questions for myself or Greg, feel free to put them in the comments, and we will do our best to get to them during the interview. If we can't get to all of them today, if there's a bunch, then we can always do them after the fact in the comments as well. So don't be shy, and feel free to jump in and barrage us with questions if you have any. So, Greg, you've been playing music and teaching music and living the lifestyle of a musician for a long time. I mean, I remember, you were very heavily on the scene when I was growing up playing, and I remember watching you play with my old teacher, Tracy Knope, many, many years ago here in Tacoma. Can you talk about how you got started playing music, and where were you born, where did you grow up, and how did you start playing?
So I grew up in Bremerton, Washington, just across the Sound here, and Tacoma was the big city, I suppose, and Seattle. And I grew up like a lot of us did, still do, in the, kind of the music education system. Started playing snare drum in 4th grade, and drum set soon after that. Jazz band at school. Bremerton had a kind of a rich history of jazz bands going to Hawaii, and I remember looking at all the pictures of the big kids, in the jazz band. Which whenever I say that, I always think of Red Kelly. Red Kelly always joked, "I just want to play with the big kids," and that was 60, 70 years beforehand. So yeah, I just always wanted to play with the big kids. Some of the pictures of the jazz band, they'd wear these dashikis in the 60s, and it just looked like they were having a lot of fun. My mom played piano a little bit, so I was familiar with how a piano worked and making noise on that. And I could play 3 little, 5th kind of chords in the left hand. And but I kind of gravitated towards the drums right away. I took piano lessons and messed around with guitars a little bit when I was younger. But drums seemed to be where I fit in. I was never really like a rudimental drum head, pardon the pun.
Well, like several artists that I talked to, myself included, when I first heard jazz, I did not like it. It was not my thing. Were you drawn to jazz immediately and jazz drums, or?
Actually, I was. My folks had this Thelonious Monk double LP live at the Olympia in Paris, something like that. And I just thought that was great. I was drawn to Thelonious Monk right away. The rhythm and the funny chords and kind of the openness of the sound. I loved the drums and the bass. They had some records by the Ventures, and of course I wanted rock and roll stuff, and I got a record by Heart, and Boston was big at the time, and so I liked that stuff as well. But I really was drawn to jazz pretty early on.
Were you aware of, again, I can just relate my own experiences, but when I first started buying, it was Charlie Parker for me, but all I listened to was Charlie Parker. I didn't really even pay attention who else was on the recordings. Later I did and became more knowledgeable about that stuff. But were you aware of, the drummers that were playing with Thelonious Monk and their names and their styles and sounds, or?
A little bit, yeah. I started tracking, who the players were kind of right away. Remember, Herb Alpert had a big hit with Rise and some of those kind of things, and I remember trying to write those out for my little combo in high school. Yeah. And the band at Bremerton, by the time I got into high school, it was really fun to be in the band, but the band started to really suck. It was pretty, it was not like it was in the heyday, or so it seemed to me, at the time. I thought, wow, somebody's got to take the ball here and kind of run with it. So I organized a little combo and tried to write out tunes. I remember writing out The In Crowd by Ramsey Lewis for the trumpet player. Yeah. This guy named Bob Cullers. I haven't talked to Bob in 40 years. If you're out there, Bob, hi. And he just kind of looked at me like, what? I was alone, I think, in a sea. I was the island.
Well, so growing up in Bremerton, I went to college in Bremerton as well. This is the late 90s. I attended Olympic College. I'm assuming, was that around when you were there? Or?
Yeah. In fact, I was I was friends with Ralph Muchler's sons. Dr. Ralph Muchler was the director at Olympic College, and he was one of the reasons the scene over there had been really great. And he was just getting ready to retire. And our friend Ron Cole got the job at Olympic College just about the time I think I was probably a junior in high school. And I went over to play with the college band. The principal at Bremerton High School, his name was Ron Gillespie, and he used to stop me in the hallways and say, now don't cut class, but if you want to go over and do the little band at the college, go ahead. And he would tell me stories about being Quincy Jones' band director. He was the band director when Quincy was over there in Bremerton before he moved to Roosevelt.
I had no idea that Quincy was in Bremerton. I just thought it was always Seattle, so that's interesting to
Quincy
hear.
started in Bremerton. Yeah. And there was a bunch of people that went to Olympic College, I'm sure you know, but Rufus Reed was a student there.
I did know that, and that's like one of the crown. When I was going there, it's like, oh, the great bassist. And one of my favorites because he was with Dexter Gordon for quite some time.
Yeah, right. A little bit later, 5-6 years ago, I was getting my master's and working on some history projects, some jazz history kind of stuff, and I did some research on Olympic College and who was there. And it turns out Olympic College started a jazz program the same year that North Texas did. And maybe one or two more. It was right after World War II. I don't want to say the exact year, 47, 48, somewhere in there. And it was one of the first jazz education programs. Back when they couldn't call it jazz, they called it big band, or stage band was a name.
I wonder, just going off the left field here for a minute, I wonder if that had anything to do with the fact that it was a naval town, maybe?
Yeah, there was a lot of Navy guys coming off ships, coming back from the war and all that ended up there. And so there was a pretty good little pool of players. Interesting, my dad was about that same age, and he was kind of around town about that age. And he told me a story after I finally started asking, and he remembers Olympic College as some old barracks and kind of Navy housing. So I think it definitely had something to do with.
Well, prior to you attending, and maybe you said this and I didn't catch it, prior to attending Olympic College, what high school did you go to? Was it Olympic High School?
No, it was Bremerton High School.
Bremerton
There
High
had been East and West Bremerton High Schools. Olympic High School was further up in Silverdale, and that was a newer school. But yeah, it was Bremerton High School, and so it was just across the bridge from Olympic College. And I used to. A couple times I remember walking across the bridge during lunch hour just to go over to the college and play. Yeah.
Were there, did you study privately with any teachers over there at the time, or?
There was a guy who had been an older student at Olympic College named Matt Stewart, who lived in Silverdale, and I studied with him a little bit. He kind of got my hands in shape. He was a traditional grip kind of guy, so this was like late 70s, maybe 1980, when I was taking lessons from him. So everybody was into weather report and match grip, not traditional grip. And it was like the newer rock and roll jazz kind of stuff. He was always steering me in that direction. And he was great at Billy Cobham kind of stuff. And I really wanted to do Buddy Rich. And so I'm embarrassed to say I didn't really listen to that weather report record until years later. And he kept saying, yeah, did you listen to that record? I'm like, yeah, I listened to it. Yeah, sure. Yeah. So it was kind of fun. But Matt was great. And he would take lessons from symphony guys in Seattle, and then he'd come back and show me different strokes and things. And so I kind of got some really great lessons, a little bit secondhand, after he got it.
So did you study in conjunction with that, like many drummers will also study marimba or vibes or something like classical technique as well? Or?
A little bit. There wasn't really anybody to study much with. Kathy Ram was a percussionist who was from Bremerton, and I would see her at some contests, solo ensemble contests. And she would judge, and she would give me little pointers once in a while, but I was never officially a student of hers. I studied classical later. I went to college at Western University, where I actually teach now. And the guy teaching percussion there was Mike Clark, who was with the Seattle Symphony and ballet and stuff. And he was great about hands and technique and marimba and xylophone and how to play crash cymbals.
Well, before we leave the Bremerton area, there's a lot of questions that I don't know, and I'm getting the luxury of asking here. So were there any venues or places to play? I know Cap DeMiro had a club out there for some time.
Yeah,
was this around? Or?
Cap was around. Cap was more of a a hairstylist, barber kind of guy that I knew played a couple gigs. I didn't interact with him much when I was in high school. There weren't really any live clubs. Cap hadn't started anything yet. I didn't really get to see live music for a long time. I remember the first time I saw a real drum set, somebody playing in a real band. I was blown away, and I was probably a sophomore, junior in high school. And then I saw the college bands play. I got to play with the jazz choir and the big band. And those bands went to Berkeley, California for a jazz festival, West Coast Jazz Festival, Berkeley Jazz Festival. And I won some solo awards there, but I got to see a lot of bands there. I remember that was a huge impact, was going to those festivals. And the Officers Club, actually, in the Navy Yard, had music once in a while. Those were my first gigs that I played.
Going back really quickly to influences, so you mentioned Thelonious Monk. So as you started getting, I mean, it sounds like by the time you're in high school, you're getting serious about playing and checking things out. And so who were some of your formative, like, main inspirations on drums? Do you remember any, like, drummer names that come to mind?
It was kind of limited. I got to see Buddy Rich live in a big band at Olympic College. He played in the gymnasium. Sounds typical, right? And my best Buddy Rich story is that I went up to him for some reason to say hi, and he said, "Hey, get lost, kid, you bug me." And I thought, yes, I got a Buddy Rich story.
How old were you when you first heard the infamous Buddy Rich tape recording?
Oh, probably in college later. I mean, I really got a load of college stuff, like here's what to listen to. When I got to Western, Sid Potter, who was the band director at the time, jazz band director, I remember going to his office, and he gave me this big stack of records. Here's Count Basie, start off with this first. Here's Art Blakey, start off with this next, just in order. And it was great the way he laid it out. And it was a stack of records like this. And that's when I really, like, mind blown, like, wow, okay, now I get it.
Lots of information to deal with and lots of different ways to go.
And lots of, like, how to be really serious about the music. Beforehand, I didn't really have anybody that showed me kind of how serious you could be about it. And there was a couple older students there who were, practically, I got more swing in my little finger than you do in your whole body, and were, like, pummeling me. And I was playing in the second band. A guy named John Guilfoyle was just a screaming player. He'd play all the percussion stuff. So it took me about a year to kind of get up to speed, but it was a great education. And then I started with the Youth Symphony. I was principal with the Youth Symphony for a little bit and played timpani there.
You're talking back in Bremerton now, or
no? This is Seattle Youth Symphony.
Oh, okay.
After I was at Western in Bellingham.
Now, what made you were in Bremerton, your high school, and also playing with some of the college stuff. What made you make the decision to go to Western? Why Western Washington University?
It's Ron Cole's fault. He said, yeah, Western's a great place. And I visited Western. I liked the scene in Bellingham. It just seemed like a good town. I had been over to Ellensburg and Central a couple times, and there was no trees over there, so I kind of poo-pooed that. I thought about auditioning for places like Berkeley and North Texas, but I didn't feel like I was really up to speed with, I knew there was some really amazing players. And I think I just wanted to go someplace and check out some music.
Well, now I know Western has a long history of great players. I didn't realize that Sid taught there. I always hear about, Chuck Israels being there in the dynasty, for better or worse, that was. So who else was around in sphere of influence in terms of, like, faculty and players at the time when you were at Western?
Actually, Milo Peterson was teaching guitar there at the time. There were some really great teachers who had just left. Again, I got there just in time to experience the downfall of a heyday, which is maybe my theme in life. I don't know. So Ron Cole was there as a grad student. Sid Potter. Milo taught guitar. There was no drum set teacher there, but it was close enough that I could drive down to Seattle, and I got to see Art Blakey a bunch. There was a pretty good core of us that would make the trip into Seattle to see somebody if they were coming through. Jazz Alley was going strong. I saw Blakey at the Rainbow, which was really kind of a divey experience, greasy, dark nightclub, just like you want. And some places like that, some little dives in Ballard. So that was fun. It was a good place to be for me at the time.
Were you? I mean, I know Bellingham also has a long history of clubs and places to play. I'm assuming you were probably playing clubs and getting things together in school and on the scene there, and also Seattle. Is that a fair assumption?
A little bit in Seattle, a lot in Bellingham. We played a lot at the world famous Up and Up Tavern. There was another one down by Railroad Avenue. Oh, Bucks, something like that. And rock bands. I had a couple different, experimental kind of rock bands, and I'd pretend I was Billy Cobham, kind of 60s rock band kind of thing. We had a fun band called E.E. Penguin. And then jazz bands, and Sid would get gigs, and we'd play with Sid. We'd put together little gigs ourselves.
At the time, like when I first met Sid, I knew him as he played trumpet. I mean, when I first met him, he was directing the jazz band at UPS, and he did that for many, many years. And he brought in wonderful artists and also transcribed. He was a wonderful transcriber, making charts and things. But I guess my question is, when you were doing gigs with Sid back in the day, was he playing trumpet or was he playing piano? Because he also plays good piano.
He was only playing trumpet. He had a really cool swing band, kind of a real trad, like sextet. Barry Ullman on clarinet. Hi, Barry. Mark Kelly, I think, played in that band some. Sid played trumpet. Bill McDonough, who was Julian's dad, played piano when I was there. A couple different bass players. A guy named Steve Johnston was a great bass player. I learned a lot from Steve. He's one of those kind of serious guys, like, come on, here's the quarter note, And I guess I learned a lot from guys doing that.
Okay, so you're attending Western. Did Sid bring any memorable guest artists while you were there studying, or not so much?
Yeah, that's the first time I met Pete Chrisley. Okay. Pete came up. I think that was with Sid. So most of the time I was there with Sid, and then I did one more quarter, and that's when Chuck Israels was there. And I can sum up my Chuck Israels experience with, I was standing looking at the bulletin board by the elevator, and he came up and introduced himself, and he was very nice. And I said, yeah, I'm the drummer. I'll probably be seeing you in big band or something, and I'll audition. And he said, well, who's your favorite bass player? And I said, well, Ray Brown. And I had just been to this jazz camp with Ray Brown, Jazzport Townsend, maybe even 2 years of that. Jeff Hamilton. I was really into Ray Brown. And he kind of looked, and he looked at me and he says, well, Ray's okay. And so, here's like Ray Brown God to me. Yeah. And here's this, like the new guy saying, well, he's okay. And I realize Chuck has a lot to offer, but that kind of set off and I did not end up playing in the big band that quarter because he wanted somebody that was going to be there the whole year. I understand that.
Well, we'll leave that there.
Yeah.
So, okay. Yeah, we could do a whole nother interview about that stuff. Well, cool. So after graduating Western, what was the story? What happened?
So I had a jazz studies degree and a composition degree in 3 years because they took a bunch of my AP math and English, so I didn't have to do a lot of core classes, did mostly music. And I had answered a notice that was on the bulletin board for auditions for the Glenn Miller Orchestra about a year before that, sent them a cassette and corresponded with those guys. After I left Western, I moved to LA, put all my stuff in my car. A friend of mine and I, Dave Buer, bass player, who now teaches at Wazoo, he was going down to study with John Clayton, and I thought, well, I'm going to go hang out with John Clayton and Jeff Hamilton and those guys. And I got to LA and played basketball a little bit, and like one lesson, and 10 days later, I got a call from the Glenn Miller Orchestra, hey, we're ready for you to come out. I was like, great, I just moved to LA, all right, let's go. And so I had the nickname in LA as 10 Day. It really had nothing to do with showing up and getting a gig right away, but but I had put it out there to the universe that I wanted that gig. So I did that, and that was actually right after a summer on cruise ships. Came off the ship and to study with Mel Lewis at Port Townsend, probably the following year after Ray Brown, and then got to go out in the Miller Band. So all of a sudden I was on the Miller Band, which was based out of New York, which is where Mel was from. And so I would go hang out with Mel Lewis on breaks and when we got back into New York.
before we go down this track any further, I want to ask you. So, I first became aware of the which is now the Centrum Jazz Festival, which used to be the Budshank Jazz Festival.
Right,
I
right.
first knew about that in like the late '90s. I had no idea, and then got a scholarship to go, and I was like, my mind was blown. I'm curious, when you attended, it was still the Budshank Festival, yes?
I think so. I knew Bud real well.
Yeah.
And I wasn't there the first year they did it, but maybe it was the second or third year.
Well, what I wanted to ask is when they were still getting it together, I'm assuming it was much smaller. Did you have a lot more access to the artists? Like you could
Yeah.
actually go get lessons with these guys while you were there? And
Yeah. So my first year there was Gary Williams and I were the only two drummers. Jeff Hamilton was the guy. And he has told me since that he wasn't sure if I was getting it because I'm pretty quiet, you know. So then the next year I came back and saw him again, and I had all that stuff together that he had been showing us. And so Gary and I go back that far. And Bud was there. Barney McClure was the.
Was he the mayor at the time of Port Townsend? I know he was mayor for a minute.
It was right after, maybe, or maybe he was the mayor. I don't remember.
It's good to be the mayor.
It's good to be the king. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, so Glenn Miller Orchestra. And
Yeah.
so what time frame are we talking about? We in the 80s now?
We're like 87, 88.
Okay. And so I'm assuming you guys were on tour a fair amount of the year?
Yeah, that band at the time was full-time on the road, lived on the bus, had like 1 week off a year.
So how many gigs a year do you figure you guys were playing?
360. It was very few nights off. It was one-nighters all over the place.
Now,
it
is
was
this-
always a hotel, though.
United States or Europe as well?
US,
Japan, all over?
Japan for a month and a half. The Japan tour, we had like 2 nights off the whole time. We were moving, and we went all the way from Sapporo down to Hokkaido, and that was my first time in Japan. And it was great. We'd be on these little towns, and the band had the promoters to put up TV commercials, so everybody knew that the famous Glenn Miller Orchestra was going to be in town. And they were one of the first ones to get into Japan, you know, when Japan started opening up and after the war and stuff. So little kids would come up to us and go, "Oh, Glenn Miller," and they'd point up to the big tall Americans walking down the street. So that was something. It was great playing with those guys. Everybody was really serious about the music.
I know, I mean, we only have an hour and we're not going to get to all the questions that I want to ask you, but I'm curious your opinions about, after traveling and playing jazz all over the United States and all over Europe and all over Asia, what's your opinion about audience response and audience turnout in other countries as opposed to the United States? And I'm not talking trash about the United States at all. My opinions are it's different. It's different. And
Yeah.
because those countries are older and have a longer history of appreciation of art and culture, your opinion, what do you think?
Well, Japan was interesting because the culture in Japan, I don't know as much about other Asian countries. Excuse me, this is really good coffee. The Japanese people seem, at least at that time, they are geeks about something. And the ones that are geeks about big band music knew everything. They knew who the drummers were. They knew what my name was. If they were the geek for big band or Glenn Miller, then that was it. And they would come up and sing lyrics to the songs that I didn't even know. That was great. But maybe they're geeks about car racing or something too. So, you know, it depends. It's not like everybody was a jazz fan. But it felt like it. You know, it was a great experience. Europe, I think, is different. Well, you were just there. I'll ask you the same question in a minute. I thought people were a lot more open to arts in Europe. And so they're a lot more open to, you know, that jazz tune. It doesn't sound like a pop tune, and I can't understand the changes, but that's cool, instead of running scared from jazz. I don't think they're steeped in the background of swing and the rhythm as we are. And so their jazz thing is a little more, I hate to generalize, but maybe straight eighth note kind of influence sometimes, or floaty, or, you know, kind of Pat Metheny-ish, whatever we want to call that. Kind of not new age, but
I've thought about this a lot, and I agree with you. What I do think, I mean, the internet came in when I was in high school, which I graduated in 1998, and I think with the advent of the internet and now, YouTube and Spotify and all this stuff,
Sure.
and particularly with the pandemic now and everyone live streaming everything, Smalls Jazz Club. I mean, you can stay current on everything. I think that has helped a ton in terms of musicians in other parts of the world being able to like really, invest time and learn.
Do you think that's kind of homogenized things a little bit?
Sure. I mean, of course. But I think, I don't have all the answers at all. These are just my opinions. But I think also, too, maybe more and more bands from the United States have been traveling and touring and doing exchanges and types of things, which has helped. And also, you have artists. There were expats, in the 1950s and 60s. A lot of U.S. musicians went over there to teach and play, which certainly helped.
Yeah.
You had someone. I mean, I think it's a fair assumption to say without expats, you wouldn't have someone like Niels Henning Ørsted Pedersen.
Right.
So I don't know. I think. Now we have drummers like Greg Hutchinson is living in Italy. He's playing with a lot of guys over there and teaching, and a lot of people are teaching online, which wasn't possible before.
Right,
So I think there's things that certainly help. But on the other side of it, I mean, there's all of us as musicians and composers, we are sum totals of everything that we grow up listening and hearing, and there's a lot of their folk music and things that are part of their culture where they've grown up that we don't have, which becomes part of their vocabulary.
Which is cool. And then maybe we hear it through somebody. I remember I was in Paris for a couple weeks. I'd been in Salzburg for a month or two, hanging out there and skiing and doing gigs and stuff, and then went to go visit Paris. And a friend of mine had an old friend. She was an art student, and her friend was an older lady who was an artist and had this. Her name was Arlene Hilliquy. And she was friends and or lovers with a bunch of the jazz and the art kind of. It was the same crowd. And on the south side of Paris, there was a little section of the city where all those guys lived. And Johnny Griffin was there. And I started asking her about all these people that had been there in the 50s. The first jazz expats, and it must have been a really great time. Experienced Newhart, and they were over there getting love and attention from the Europeans, and just like a different branch of how the music developed and had a opportunity to play and grow.
Yes. I would love to go down this rabbit hole, but I want to talk about you.
Right.
So, can you talk about so when you were on Glenn Miller and playing with that band? I'm sure you're experiencing all these wonderful gigs and things, but I'm sure there must have been other wonderful musicians on the band with you that you were able to learn from. Anyone that you recall from those days?
Yeah, there was one of my roommates was a guy named George Reinert. He's back on the band again after all these years. He kind of went back and forth. He's a really great trombone player. I got some of my buddies on. Dave Beer was on bass for a while. There was a guy named Rich on piano. Some really great players. The thing that did for me the most, though, was it got me out and about and to New York and to Mel Lewis, who I'd met before, but Mel was there a bunch. And I actually got fired off that band because I wanted to play like Mel. So I knew Mel had done one record with the Glenn Miller kind of a ghost band thing, and I loved that record. That was my favorite kind of Glenn Miller stuff. So I wasn't playing Little Brown Jug like Mo Pertel. I was playing it like Mel Lewis. And the band leader at the time, his name was Dick Gerhardt, great band leader, tenor sax guy, kind of did the Tex Beneke thing. But his guy was Zoot Sims. He sounded like Zoot, so we called him Zoot. Zoot wanted like old school stuff, and rightly so, And so somebody else came along and auditioned for the band, and I got a call one day that said, "Greg, we're going to go with somebody else." And it was, over a year that I was on the band.
So there wasn't any like job security? Someone could just call up the band leader and say, "I want to audition for the band," and then...
Yeah, they were always auditioning players for the band. And at the time, it was a lot of North Texas guys. And they were, amazing technicians and really interested. And the guy that took the gig after me actually was Joe Farnsworth, who's a great drummer in New York now, plays at Smalls a bunch.
Time to swing.
Time to swing, yeah. And Joe's great. I remember he came in and played the drum solo for American Patrol was a real definite thing. It's all written out. And he came in and he played Art Blakey's jazz march, blues march, like the intro to Blues March. And I thought, man, that is so hip. I wish I could do that. And so then the next day I'm like, I did that. And I think that was probably the beginning of the end for me. But what happened was I got off the bus in Indianapolis, flew home, and I got a call from Woody Herman's band. Hey, we hear that you got fired from the Miller band. Do you want to come out and play with us? I'm like, of course, you know. So it was very soon after that I was out with.
So you
Woody.
became, so I mean, one door closes,
Yeah.
obviously. Well, so member of the Thundering Herd, so who was on the band? Because they've always had a wonderful
Man,
cast of characters.
those are serious guys. That was a scary time. I was in a little bit over my head. The bass player was Tony Shearer, who still plays great in New York. I just saw him with the pianist, Dave Berkman. Dave was on the band. Nugent was in the tenor section. Leading the band was spaced on his name. He's still alive. Everybody's going to be shouting at the screen going.
You can put it in the comments later.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Eric Miyashiro was playing lead trumpet, who played with Buddy Rich and plays a lot of gigs now. I've seen Eric a couple times over the years. We did a Japanese relief for Japan after the tidal waves. Tony Catlick played lead trumpet after Eric. Hello. It was just all monster players on the band.
And so before joining that band, how many years had you been touring with Glenn Miller?
It was about a year and a half.
About a year and a half. And so after that, then the association with Woody Herman, how long did that last?
Was almost a year. And that had been a really rough period. So Woody had gotten sick and was not on the road. And that was when I started kind of hanging out and talking to those guys. And then Woody passed away, although I met Woody a couple times. So I never actually played with Woody, but he was still alive. And then right when Woody died, the bookings went south. So instead of concerts and jazz festivals, it was like Elks Clubs. And it was a tough time for the band. And they went through 5 or 6 drummers. And then I came on and lasted for almost a year. And it was not an easy time. It was a lot of personalities on the band. And so when I left to go out with Harry James. And the pay doubled, and Fred Radke was directing that at the time. Everybody got our own rooms.
Was the band at that time, was it based out of New York or was it based in Seattle?
The Harry James band was just on the road. It was a big, long tour. So it wasn't really based someplace. Woody's band was kind of based in New York. I think and that really just means when the bus stops going and the concerts end for that time period, where does the bus stop at? The bus stops in New York and you get off and then everybody kind of goes their way. Yeah,
the reason I ask is because I know Fred resides in Seattle. Maybe he didn't at the time, but I was curious if maybe that's...
Yeah, no, that's where I think I got off the road, came back to Seattle, and Fred asked me to lunch, and we hung out for a little bit and talked, then he offered me the gig.
Well, now, we're talking about all this big band stuff. Before we move on to the next subject, how many years were you with Harry James? Or still, I mean, there were gigs you still played.
That was about a year of mostly on the road. Maybe like 3 months and then kind of off for a little bit and then another couple little things here and there.
And so then after that, you decided to stay in Seattle, or were you still in New York at the time?
My stuff was living in L.A. So I eventually went back to Los Angeles and then came back to Seattle.
What spurred the decision to come back to Seattle? Family or?
Yeah, kind of family. First wife. And I had been hanging out with John Clayton, and Jeff Clayton especially was a big influence on me about gigs, getting gigs. And they were like, go out and find your own gigs, kind of what you do. Yeah. Find your own spots to play, stir the pot, make your own scene. Yeah. And Seattle looked like a really good place at the time to do that.
We could do a whole other 3-hour interview with you on that because you've done so much over your career. I mean, it says it on the bio that I posted, but there's Ponyboy Records, There's the jazz picnic.
Yeah.
Being involved with Earshot.
Yeah.
Also the Boxleys and the North Bend Jazz Walk. I mean, we could talk about any of these at length, and I would like to start the conversation. But what I wanted to ask you also too was, aside from the big band work, you've been worked with a lot of other wonderful minds, Ernestine Anderson and
Steve Allen.
D. Daniels as well, correct?
D. Daniels, yeah.
Yeah. Also, a long-standing relationship. I know you played quite a bit with Bill Ramsey. You've played quite a bit with Buddy Catlett over the years.
My heroes.
Yeah. So, any other small group stuff that you've gone out on the road with? I know. Were you Ernestine's musical director for a while, or?
Yeah. So, with long time with Ernestine, I did a lot of road stuff with Ernestine. We did Japan maybe 6 times, Blue Note clubs, and really kind of the highbrow jazz venues.
How did you cross paths with Ernestine to begin with?
Through Larry Fuller. Larry Fuller was her pianist, and he was kind of new at the time, and I was just moving back to Seattle at the time, and we played a little bit. And maybe within about a year, I ended up on Ernestine's gig as the drummer. And then when Larry left, a couple of years after that, I was literally the one left holding the bag of music. And so, okay, Greg, let's meet at the airport, or I'll come by and pick you up and bring the music. And I was kind of the guy I was kind of the straw boss a little bit, kind of organized the players. And we would pick up really great players in different cities, and had our group of regulars. But I got to meet a lot of people in different towns through that.
Well, it's kind of like the musical directors at the time. I can't remember, the Tree, the guy that passed away, who's his nickname for the Temptations and Four Tops. He was the musical director. They would go with the main core group, and from town to town they would hire musicians that they needed.
Yeah.
So you'd have to have a roster of like really great players that could come in and do the job well.
Right.
Yeah.
Styx Hooper was her manager for a while, and he kind of hooked us up with some really interesting players. A couple guys from Brazil. We played the Brazil Jazz Festivals. It was 3 weeks down there. I played with all these Brazilian players. That was an education.
So when was this after you had started Ponyboy Records? What was the decision to start your own label and
It was
get
about
that
the
going?
time it started. I think I started Ponyboy Records about 93, 4, 5, somewhere in there. And that was when I started working with Ernestine. So it was part of kind of stirring the pot and being an instigator, and hey, let's start something called a record label, and that'll look cool on the poster when we have a gig someplace. And I was kind of making fun of the whole record label scene. I had seen some promo material from Concord Records, and I thought, this looks cool. These are the guys I like. I'm just going to do whatever they do. So when they would send out a package for the latest Raybound record, I would just copy all that. And then it got to be kind of serious. Ponyboy Records. Ponyboy was a friend of mine who ended up being my insurance agent, and was kind of a guy about town. And we took and stretched his head out in Photoshop and made this funny cartoon of him. And his nickname was Ponyboy, and he would make mixtapes for his friends at Christmas. So I thought, well, this will be like one of his mixtapes. And so for a long time, the Ponyboy Records logo was his head, and Ponyboy in a kind of a funny font. I was also really into Bob and Bob, kind of some modern art at the time, and their thing from San Francisco was putting up posters, and so the art was like distributing kind of media, posters, cards, music, flyers. It was all part of the kind of the art project. And so I looked at it like that. And then it became kind of a serious music thing. It's like, uh-oh, people expect serious music now. And that was cool. So like Origin Records, which started about the same time, they always started out as kind of like a serious label thing. So I always felt like I had this kind of extra little niche where I could make fun of people.
Well, I'm curious, speaking about putting things together and lasting a long time, there was the long-standing gig. Is it Hiroshi's that you played for
Yeah,
quite some time?
Hiroshi's.
Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Man, that was one of my favorite gigs. So Jazz and Sushi was the name of the series. And it was a sushi place on East Lake that I started going to that was called Tommy's Sushi. And Tommy was the sushi guy. And I used to go in there and spend too much money and have great sushi. And then Hiroshi bought it from him, and Tommy moved to Bellevue. And so I got to know Hiroshi. And one day I just said, actually it was over a lot of days, I said, yeah, this would be a great spot for a jazz thing. And it's pretty small, kind of big for a sushi place, but really a small venue. Like the whole place wasn't much larger than this stage. And he went for it. Thought it'd be a great idea, and you know, I approached it like, what can I do to help you make your restaurant more fun and bring more people in? And so that was what I tried to do. It brought a really variety of people in. It was a fun little gig to bring somebody as a guest who was in from out of town. You know, we had some pretty big names in this little sushi restaurant.
And that series lasted for quite some time.
It was like 7 or 8 years.
Yeah, which is in
every
terms
Friday
of,
night.
Yeah, in terms of jazz clubs, I mean that's or jazz gigs. That's impressive. Now, can you talk a little bit? Also, a thing that you started with the record label, and was it jazz in the park or what, the jazz picnic?
Yeah, Jazz Picnic was a 1-day free jazz festival at Sandpoint Magnuson Park, which was really close to where I lived. And they had just built this big outdoor amphitheater, and I was down there riding my bike or something and ran into the guy who was kind of head of the booking for that spot and a bunch of other stuff in the park. It's a city park, Seattle City Park. And he said they were looking for stuff, and I'm like, hey, I've got a record label and all these artists, and how about I arrange a stage, and I got a tent, and I got sponsors to donate all this stuff, and a great sponsor for a grand piano, and then all the artists came in and played for free, but it was everybody played like a half-hour set, really short set, and kind of guests and sitting in with everybody. And I spent a lot of effort and time making it so nobody felt like they were playing a gig, but it was more like just a 6-hour jam session. And it was a lot of fun, and it lasted 10 years. Yeah.
What I'm curious, just as someone who puts things together myself. So 7 or 8 years with Hiroshi's, and then the picnic. What made you decide to stop, or were there factors outside of your control that made it have to end?
Yeah, well, the Jazz and Sushi, he eventually sold that restaurant, and he had started doing all the sushi vending for, I want to say the Kingdom, but no, it's not the Kingdom anymore. Yeah.
Sports Dome.
Sports stuff. And he was really busy with that, very successful with that, plus a catering business. And so the restaurant, he was running 3 really successful businesses, and a couple of years of just making him crazy. So he closed the restaurant. He now still has a catering kitchen where you can get the sushi. If anybody wants to go out and get sushi from Hiroshi, you can get it up on Beacon Hill. The Seattle City Park, Magnuson Park, they started wanting more money, and the last straw was when they wanted so much money to rent the outdoor amphitheater that I said, fine, let's just do it inside one of the buildings. So the last year, we did it inside of a building. It cost me like $1,000 or something. And this was just a free kind of event, you know? Community people, nobody's getting paid to play. And I didn't want to spend $1,000 anymore. So we did it one more year inside the building. And we set up a table outside to sell T-shirts and posters. Because again, I was still I love the T-shirts and everybody around. Yeah, the artwork. Make it look fun. So somebody saw that we had a table set up outside under a tent. I had volunteers selling shirts. And they wanted money for the space that the table was at. And it wasn't the same guy that was there. And so I said, okay, 10 years. We can do something someplace else. And Boxley's had started up, and there was a big scene going on in North Bend. And so, things kind of transitioned.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that, because that's been a very huge success. I mean, even despite COVID and all the trials and tribulations with different venues and things, it's not about again, this is just my opinion. I don't have all the answers, but it's not about the venues as much as that sounds terrible, but it's more about the musicians and the audience. Those things never change. Venues come and go, whether they're liked or disliked,
Right.
but so I think the work that you've done, all those things kind of carry on into the next thing. You know what I mean? With the
Sure.
audience and the musicians. So can you talk about your association with Boxley's and the jazz presence out in the North Bend area?
Yeah, so old friends of mine, 2 brothers, and the younger brother was Danny Kolke of 3 brothers. Danny called me up one day, and I had played years earlier on his first record as a piano player, his first trio record, and he was a teenager. And he was pretty precocious. So fast forward, 20 years, many years. And he called up and said, hey, I want to start a jazz club in North Bend. He had a software company. He was living in North Bend. He says, not much going on. There's this restaurant for sale. You should come out and look at it. And I came out, rode my Harley up there, and I said, wow, this is really a big place. You're crazy. And he kind of looked at me and he said, yeah, well. And I said, but if you do this, I'll book some music. And I think we started right off the bat with 7 nights a week of music. Super ambitious. And it scaled back over the next year or two to 4 or 5 nights. We had jam sessions on Sunday nights for students. Student was always a big thing, students, because he had kids. I always attributed his kids towards him wanting to do a lot of student stuff. But now his kids are out of school, and we're still doing it. So that lasted as a really great restaurant. He kept on the kitchen staff that was there before, and a lot of people still remember the food that was there. That lasted 7 or 8 years. Yeah. Nonprofit started along the way in there, so that kind of helped with a lot of the budget. Yeah. And eventually that closed. That location closed, and we opened up another spot that was in an old firehouse just a block away. Yeah. And that lasted a couple years. And it was kind of tied in with a winery and a little restaurant next door. Yeah. And after a while that closed. And only a couple months went by, and he said, I can't not do this. Yeah. So he found kind of what I'd been saying all the time. Find someplace really small that you can manage that's, low overhead. Just do the music. I mean, I love the food, but, keep it simple and easy for volunteers to kind of run and stuff. And so the present space, we call it Boxley's 3.0, is a really nice space, and he spent a lot of his own money, and then the board has helped out a lot of volunteers to make it just a nice little cozy space. 3 couches, and maybe it fits 50 people, and nice little stage, and Danny has his piano in there. Yeah. We started doing some kind of recording stuff in there, and then the pandemic hit, and I think we took a cue from Smalls and started doing streaming only a couple months after the pandemic thing. Yeah. So that was a way to still do some music in there, no audience live. We were masked up on stage to begin with, and very concerned about the optics of how it looks to be masked. And, we got a lot of comments about, hey, you guys are going to make everybody sick and all that. We'll talk about that later, too. But that was a lot of fun. And Danny kept buying more cameras and more gear and more computers, and now it's a really slick setup and looks great and sounds great. Takes 2 volunteers to run it. And now we're open to the public again, so we're still.
It's 4 nights a week, 3 nights a week?
So right now it's still just Friday and Saturday. Okay. But we are going to start doing the Pro-Am Big Band on Thursdays, once a month.
And it's back to hybrid, so people can come in person and watch.
Come in person,
and then people can also watch online.
Yep.
And is it free to attend, or some shows are cover charge, most are free? Or
it's free to attend. We encourage membership. Membership goes into the nonprofit, and there should be some perks for if you're a member, you get in free. And they did charge like $5 for a cover charge. So if you were a member, you didn't have to pay the $5 cover charge. But then that went away with the pandemic. So right now it's just free.
Yeah, but to be fair, I mean, during the pandemic, you guys kept a lot of musicians working, and which was huge, you know. So I mean, that's and also still, I mean, there were like student things that could be done for, there were like aside from the concerts, there were like play along things that they would present where musicians would come in and have different artists come in and play along with musicians and record it. And
Danny made like little rhythm section tracks, and then have people send in their play along, virtual tracks recorded at home on the phone. So we figured out how to do that. I was also at the time I had just left, I'd gotten a master's degree at Central. So I knew a whole bunch of new people there, and I just started doing photography and video on my own, where I could do really nice video shots of a couple cameras. And so we kind of combined all that. And I was doing a lot of virtual performances for choirs and stuff. So yeah, it all feeds, everything feeds everything else.
Well, I knew this would happen, and I knew that I was going to lose track of time. So at this time, if you have any questions for Greg or myself, please put them in the comments, and I would be happy to answer any of them or let Greg know so that he can answer. So please put them in. If we don't get it to him now, we can always do them after the fact. But until I see any questions show up here, I'm just going to keep barraging our guest with questions here. So all right, so can you talk a little bit now? I mean, we've talked about just the tip of the iceberg on some of the groups that you played with and artists, because you've been all over the place. Can you talk a little bit about, as an educator, I mean, you've always kind of taught lessons on the side, at least as far as I've known, but you went back to school to get masters, correct?
Yeah, I wanted to. I could see kind of the writing on the wall that gigs were slowing down a little bit. It was a long time where I did a lot of gigs, you know, weddings and concerts and gigs and live stuff, and a lot of it seemed to be kind of drying up. And I saw some kind of climate change in Seattle about parking downtown. And I was just feeling like maybe it's time for a change. So I wanted to get a little more serious about education, kind of at a higher ed level, university level, because I've always liked college age students, and done a lot of clinics and that. So I actually called up Chris Bruyere, who was at Central at the time. Directed the jazz department there, and I said, hey, do you guys need like a jazz TA or anything? I was trying to think, how can I get into be jazz faculty kind of, without having to go through the audition process and all that, And I knew some other friends that had gotten their master's degree, and they ended up being the jazz TA, kind of assistant faculty, and I thought maybe that's good for me. And he was like, yeah, I need a TA, come on over. So I was definitely an older, non-standard student.
It's like the Rodney Dangerfield back to school with
yeah.
less liability.
Yeah. More so than you know. Yeah. I'm going to tell this story. Okay, even if it gets me in trouble. Yeah. So the first time I directed the third jazz band was what I was supposed to direct, one of the things. And then I taught a bunch of lessons in some other classes. And one of the trombone players said something funny. And I said, oh, that's what she said. I'm still trying to make groups of people laugh. Call it career hazard, working with Don Rickles and all those guys. So the way I tell the story is probably a funnier story than what actually happened. But Bruyere said to me, he says, my office after class, and he says, you really shouldn't say stuff like that. People get in trouble for less. Yeah. So he wasn't really scolding me, but it was friendly advice, and it was good advice. So yeah, I was a little bit of a Rodney Dangerfield, and I still am. So I did the time at Central 2 years, and I joked that they kicked me out because I got my degree. Yeah. So then I spent a year or two, maybe just a year, and was visiting people around, and went to Western, my old undergrad stomping grounds, and met the guys up there. And Pat Roulette was the percussionist, and I called him and submitted some application kind of stuff. And I was kind of getting ready for auditions, and maybe I'd have to travel a little bit. I was looking at UNC and some other places, and they just emailed me one day, say, hey, you want to come up and teach some lessons and do some master classes? And it just snowballed. Yeah. And then the pandemic hit, and I was able to do online Zoom lessons really easily because I had all this camera stuff and could show different angles of the drum set. And on Zoom would go, hey, let's check out this Art Blakey video that's on YouTube. Yeah. And so kind of a hybrid combined playing and watching and learning. Yeah.
There's a question on here.
Yeah.
And it's from our mutual friend. It's from Jeff Hamilton. He said, how could you forget Frank Tiberi's name?
Well, there's a reason I could forget Tiberi's name. Yeah, Frank was a very interesting character at the time. Yeah.
I remember we had Jeff's band up here. At the time, I was directing the Pierce College Jazz Ensemble, and I remember I called him to do the gig, and there was some confusion because I guess there was like a Pierce College in California as well, so we thought it was like zero travel, and then he realized what it was, and was like, ah. Oh, anyways, they came up and they did a great workshop, and it was lovely to have them. During the workshop, he mentioned, for people that were studying drums in this area, he mentioned both you and he mentioned Gary. He said, if you are serious about drums, you should check out these guys here in the area. Yeah. So, wonderful, wonderful drummer. All right, cool. Well, can we talk a little bit then about So you're now teaching at Western.
Mm-hmm.
Are you still teaching in North Bend, like involved with some of the Boxley's education stuff?
Yeah, I teach 1 day a week in North Bend. I teach 3 days a week in Bellingham, and lead some bands and drum set pedagogy for future band directors, stuff like that. A little bit of jazz history. I actually taught jazz improv last quarter, which was great, telling tenor players what scales to play, and I've learned enough of that stuff.
We need it. We need it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then some things about rhythm. And then I usually teach 1 day a week out of my home studio.
So if people want to find out what's going on in terms of things with gigs or Ponyboy Records or projects that you're doing or studying or anything music related, how can they get in touch with you and find out what's happening?
So you can find me. My email is greg@ponyboyrecords.com, Greg. There is a website for Ponyboy Records, but I admit I haven't updated it in many, many years. I put the new records up there as they come out. We still put out CDs a little bit, but frankly, they just kind of end up going online and streaming anyway.
Well, in the time that we have left, you've been all over the world with all these wonderful musicians and minds and been able to associate and play gigs with people and teach, and you're still very active in the music scene. If someone were to come to you and say, hey, I'm thinking about being a musician or having a life as a musician or trying to get better at this, what are some things that you found very helpful personally for you and your experiences to help you grow and maintain your lifestyle that you would maybe impart onto them?
Well, for me, it was really advantageous to focus. And I think it's even harder now to focus on, because there's so much available, streaming and online, everything that you really need to focus on a certain style or way you're going to play, or and that's what I did. I wanted to play straight ahead swing. I wanted to sound like Mel Lewis, or Jeff Hamilton, or any of the Miles Davis drummers. I had a really narrowed kind of thing. But then at the same time, I knew that I could, even though I had kind of eschewed all other education, I didn't have an education degree, I couldn't teach band in a high school or something, but I could do graphics and I could go out and get gigs, I could instigate stuff. There was all that support kind of stuff that I could do that would help along the presence of a record label or gigs themselves. So in one way I was really focused and narrow in what I was doing. But in another way, I was really broad about how I could help that one thing out, and I think that's still pretty valid. A lot of people will say, do as much as you can to support your music and do as many different kinds of music, and I don't think that's so good. If you do 10 different kinds of music, you're not going to have as much impact. I've played rock and roll, and I do some symphony stuff once in a while and all that, but I definitely have a focus that I'm good at and people know me for.
Excellent advice. Well, Greg, thank you so much for your time today. There's several more questions that I have for you, and we'll have to do this again because I want to talk about composing and all the time on the road with all these other artists and things as well. But anyways, thank you for your time today. It's been an honor having you with us today. And so thank you to our viewers. Again, this is part of our regular weekly series. All the live streams and concerts, for the most part, are all ages and free and open to the public. So if you find value in the work that we're doing, feel free to make a donation to support our work. You can do that online via Venmo or PayPal or mailing a check, and that information is at the beginning of this post. We're going to take a very short break, do a quick little sound check here, and then play a bunch of our brand new original music of Greg and mine. Yeah. And so feel free to tune in and check that out as well. And all of these things also live on YouTube. So if you can't listen to it in real time, you can always watch it after the fact. And also, too, if you have questions that you think about after the fact that you'd like Greg and I to answer, feel free to put it in the comments, and we can do that at a later time. So thank you so much for joining us, and hope to see you again shortly.
I'm looking forward to playing.